Most men carry a quiet fear they rarely put into words, and it has very little to do with intimacy itself. The real tension comes from that fragile moment when they show interest and everything suddenly shifts, when the energy changes, when the woman pulls back, becomes distant, or responds in a way that instantly shuts everything down. That single experience, repeated a few times, creates hesitation, second-guessing, and a kind of internal pressure that makes every future interaction feel like a risk. But what if the problem isn't your confidence, your looks, or even your timing? What if the issue is the entire framework you've been using without realizing it? Because most men approach intimacy as something that needs to be initiated directly, something that requires a clear move, a request, or a step forward that puts everything on the line. And that approach naturally creates pressure, both for you and for her. It turns a shared experience into a decision point, and decision points are where hesitation lives. But there's another way to approach this, one that shifts the dynamic completely, a way where intimacy isn't something you ask for, but something that unfolds naturally because the right emotional conditions are already in place. This isn't about tricks, manipulation, or saying the perfect line. It's about understanding how women actually process connection on an emotional level. When you understand that, everything changes. You stop chasing outcomes, and you start creating experiences. You stop worrying about rejection, and you start noticing how the interaction feels moment by moment. And when that shift happens, the pressure disappears, not just for her, but for you as well. Before we go deeper into this, I want to make this interactive. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. I always find it interesting seeing how far these conversations reach. I'm Isabella, and I genuinely like knowing who's on the other side of the screen, tuning in and paying attention. Now here's something almost no one explains properly about female psychology when it comes to intimacy. Women don't reject intimacy as an idea. What they respond to is the emotional experience attached to that moment. If the interaction feels tense, rushed, uncertain, or pressured in any way, her instinct is to pull back, even if she was initially attracted to you. But when the experience feels natural, safe, and emotionally aligned, something different happens. There's no internal resistance, no need to overthink, and no sudden shift in energy. What you're about to learn is how to create that kind of environment without forcing anything, without overcompensating, and without putting yourself in a position where rejection becomes likely. This is about understanding how connection builds from the inside out, not from surface-level actions, but from how the entire interaction feels to her on a deeper level. To really understand how this works, you have to shift your perspective on what rejection actually means in these moments. Most men interpret a woman pulling back as a rejection of them personally, as if she has evaluated them and decided they're not good enough. But in reality, that's almost never what's happening. What she's responding to is the emotional atmosphere in that exact moment. If something about the interaction feels off, even slightly, her instinct is to protect her comfort and her emotional state. This is where most misunderstandings begin. A woman can be genuinely attracted to you, she can enjoy your presence, laugh with you, feel curious about you, and still pull back if the emotional timing doesn't feel right. That doesn't mean the attraction disappeared. It means the environment didn't support it. And that distinction is critical, because once you understand it, you stop taking these moments personally and start paying attention to what actually matters, which is how she feels in your presence. Think about it this way. Every interaction carries a certain emotional tone, and that tone is constantly shifting based on subtle cues. Your energy, your pace, your level of calm or tension, all of it contributes to how safe or unsafe the moment feels to her. If she senses pressure, even indirectly, her body reacts before her mind even has time to process it. And that reaction shows up as hesitation, distance, or a sudden change in behavior. But when the emotional tone feels relaxed, when there's no sense that she's being pushed toward a decision, something else happens. Her guard lowers naturally. She becomes more present, more open, more willing to explore the connection without overthinking it. And in that state, attraction has space to grow instead of being shut down. This is why trying to force clarity too early often backfires. The moment you try to define where things are going, or push for a clear outcome, you shift her out of that natural emotional flow and into analysis. And analysis is where doubt lives. It's where she starts asking herself questions she wasn't even thinking about before. Questions like whether this is moving too fast, whether she's ready, or whether she might regret it later. So instead of focusing on getting a yes, your focus needs to shift toward maintaining the right emotional experience. When the experience feels right, the outcome takes care of itself. You don't need to convince her, and you don't need to push anything forward. She moves naturally based on how she feels, not based on what you ask for. And that's a completely different dynamic than what most men are used to operating from. If you zoom out and look at most interactions where things go wrong, you'll notice a pattern. It usually comes down to a few core mistakes that seem small in the moment but completely shift how the interaction feels to her. The first is asking too directly, turning what should be a natural flow into something that feels like a transaction. The second is moving too quickly, before any real emotional connection has had time to develop. The third is bringing an energy that feels tense, uncertain, or needy, even if the words themselves sound fine. And the fourth is trying to escalate without first creating any meaningful emotional tension or connection. Individually, these might not seem like a big deal, but combined, they create an environment where she feels like she's being led toward a decision instead of experiencing something organically. And the moment she feels that shift, her instincts kick in. Not because she doesn't like you, but because her body is wired to protect her emotional safety first. This is where a deeper understanding of how women actually make decisions becomes important. Men often approach these situations logically. There's attraction, there's opportunity, so the next step seems obvious. But for women, the process is far more emotional and internal. It's not about checking boxes or following a sequence. It's about how the entire interaction feels in her body, in her nervous system, in that present moment. When she feels calm, understood, and emotionally at ease, her decisions become effortless. There's no internal conflict, no need to overanalyze, and no hesitation. But when something feels even slightly off, her system flags it immediately, and she pulls back, sometimes without even fully understanding why. What you need to realize is that these feelings don't just happen randomly. They're influenced by everything you bring into the interaction: your tone, your pace, your presence, and even your intention. If your focus is on trying to get somewhere, she feels that. If your focus is on genuinely enjoying the moment and allowing things to unfold, she feels that too. And that's the shift that changes everything. Instead of trying to lead her toward a specific outcome, you start creating a space where she feels comfortable enough to move forward on her own. You stop thinking in terms of steps and start thinking in terms of experience. Because when the experience is right, the progression happens naturally, without you having to force anything. This is also where most men unintentionally sabotage themselves. They get caught up in what they should do next, instead of paying attention to what's actually happening. They miss the subtle signals, the shifts in energy, the moments where slowing down would create more connection instead of less. And in doing so, they create resistance where there didn't need to be any at all. There's another layer to this that completely changes how you approach these interactions, and it comes down to understanding how desire actually develops over time. Most men operate from the assumption that attraction is either there or it isn't, and that it shows up quickly and clearly. That assumption comes from how men experience attraction themselves. It tends to be immediate, visual, and straightforward. You see someone you're drawn to, and within seconds your body and mind are already aligned on what you feel. But for women, it doesn't work that way. Attraction is not a single moment for her, it's a process. It builds gradually through layers of emotional experience, through small moments of connection, through how she feels in your presence over time. It's influenced by how safe she feels, how relaxed she is, how curious she becomes about you, and how much anticipation starts to grow beneath the surface. This is why you can meet a woman and feel strong chemistry instantly, while she seems neutral or even slightly distant at first. It's not that she's uninterested or playing games, it's that her attraction hasn't had the chance to build yet. And if you misinterpret that and start pushing for a result too early, you interrupt the very process that would have created the connection you're looking for. What's actually happening is that her mind is slowly gathering information. She's paying attention to how you carry yourself, how consistent you are, how you respond to her, and how the interaction feels overall. Each of these moments adds another layer to her perception of you. And when those layers align in a positive way, something shifts internally. She goes from neutral to curious, from curious to engaged, and from engaged to genuinely drawn in. This shift can take time, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes even days or weeks, depending on the context. And that's where patience becomes one of the most powerful tools you have. Not passive waiting, but active presence, being fully engaged in the interaction without trying to rush it forward. When you understand this, you stop trying to accelerate something that has its own natural pace. You stop interpreting her initial responses as final judgments, and instead you focus on consistently creating positive emotional experiences that allow her attraction to develop naturally. This also removes a huge amount of pressure from you. You're no longer trying to make something happen in a fixed window of time. You're allowing something to grow. And growth always feels different than force. It feels lighter, more natural, and far more sustainable. And once you start operating from this perspective, everything changes. You become more patient, more observant, and more in tune with the moment. And that alone creates a completely different experience for her, one where she doesn't feel rushed or evaluated, but instead feels like she's discovering the connection at her own pace, which is exactly what allows her desire to fully come to life. Now, this is where everything starts to come together in a practical way, because once you understand how attraction builds over time, you also begin to see why direct approaches often fail. When you turn intimacy into something that needs to be asked for outright, you unintentionally shift the entire interaction into a transactional frame. It stops being about shared experience and starts feeling like a request that requires approval. And the moment it feels like that, her mind moves out of emotion and into analysis. That analytical state is where hesitation lives. It's where she starts weighing consequences, thinking about timing, considering how things might look or feel afterward. Even if she was enjoying the moment seconds before, that shift alone can create enough internal resistance for her to pull back. Not because she doesn't want you, but because the way it was presented made her feel like she had to decide instead of simply experience. What most men don't realize is that the more direct the approach, the more pressure it creates, even if the intention behind it is completely normal. Questions that seem simple on the surface can feel heavy in that moment because they force her into a yes or no position. And when someone feels pushed toward a binary decision, their natural response is often to protect themselves by choosing the safer option, which is usually no or hesitation. But when you remove that transactional feeling and replace it with a natural flow, everything changes. Instead of asking for something, you create an environment where things can happen without needing to be defined. The interaction stays within the emotional space rather than shifting into a logical one, and that's exactly where attraction thrives. Think about how different it feels when something unfolds naturally compared to when it's explicitly requested. When there's no pressure, no expectation, and no sense that something needs to happen, the moment becomes lighter. She doesn't feel like she's being led somewhere. She feels like she's choosing to be there. And that sense of choice is what makes her more open, not less. This is also why subtlety becomes so powerful. Small shifts in how you communicate, how you frame things, and how you respond can completely change how the interaction is experienced. Instead of creating moments where she has to respond to you, you create moments where she simply reacts to how she feels. And when she's responding to her own feelings instead of your requests, the dynamic becomes effortless. There's no tension, no awkward pauses, and no sudden changes in energy. Everything flows at a pace that feels right for both of you, which is exactly what allows intimacy to develop without resistance. Now let's move into something that feels counterintuitive at first, but once you understand it, it changes how you handle those moments where the energy is building. Most men believe that when there's chemistry, the right move is to lean in harder, to push forward, to capitalize on the moment before it disappears. And on the surface, that seems logical. If things are going well, why not move things forward? But what actually happens most of the time is the opposite. The more a man leans in at that exact moment, the more the pressure increases. Even if it's subtle, even if it's unintentional, she feels it. And that feeling of being pulled towards something too quickly triggers a natural response in her to slow things down or create distance. not because she lost interest, but because her system needs space to stay comfortable. This is where a different approach becomes incredibly powerful. Instead of always moving closer when the energy rises, you occasionally do the opposite. You create just a little bit of space, not in a cold or disconnected way, not in a way that feels like rejection, but in a relaxed, natural way that shows you're not dependent on the moment going in any specific direction. That small shift does two important things at the same time. First, it removes any sense of pressure that may have been building, which instantly allows her to relax again. Second, it creates a kind of emotional space where her own desire has room to come forward. And when that happens, the dynamic flips. Instead of you moving toward her, she starts moving toward you. This is something you'll notice once you start paying attention. When the pressure disappears, her curiosity increases. She becomes more aware of the connection, more engaged, more willing to lean in herself. And because that movement is coming from her, it feels natural and comfortable instead of forced. A simple example makes this clear. Imagine you're sitting close, the conversation is flowing, there's eye contact, there's a sense of connection. Most men would use that moment to escalate, maybe by moving closer or increasing physical contact. But if you pause instead, if you lean back slightly, shift your posture, or even briefly redirect the focus of the moment, something interesting happens. She notices the shift, not in a negative way, but in a way that makes her more aware of what she was feeling. And that awareness often pulls her in. She might lean closer, reinitiate contact, or bring the focus back to the connection you were sharing. And now, instead of you pushing the moment forward, she's participating in it equally. That's the key difference. You're not taking control away from her. You're giving her space to step into it. And when she feels like she's choosing the direction of the interaction, rather than being led into it, everything becomes smoother, more natural, and far less likely to trigger resistance. Now we move into something more subtle, but extremely powerful when you understand how to use it correctly. Instead of trying to move things forward by asking for something directly, you begin to guide the interaction by influencing how she feels in the moment. Not through manipulation, not through tricks, but by bringing awareness to the emotional connection that is already building between you. Most men rely on questions when they want to escalate. They think in terms of asking, suggesting, or getting confirmation. But questions, especially direct ones, shift the interaction into a place where she has to think, evaluate, and respond consciously. And the moment she enters that state, the natural flow of the interaction is interrupted. What works far more effectively is learning how to express observations that highlight the connection without demanding anything from her. When you say something that reflects the energy between you, you're not asking her to decide anything. You're simply giving language to what she may already be feeling, but hasn't fully processed yet. This creates a very different experience for her. Instead of feeling like she has to respond to you, she starts tuning into herself. She becomes more aware of the comfort, the ease, the subtle attraction that's building. And when those feelings become clear in her mind, she naturally leans into them rather than pulling away. For example, when you notice that the interaction feels smooth, instead of trying to move it somewhere, you might casually acknowledge that ease. When you feel a sense of closeness, you might express that in a simple, relaxed way. These kinds of statements don't carry pressure. They don't require an answer, but they gently direct her attention toward the emotional experience you're sharing. There's also something deeper happening here psychologically. When you put her internal experience into words accurately, she feels understood. And that sense of being understood creates a strong emotional bond. It signals that you're paying attention, not just to what she says, but to how she feels. And that kind of awareness is rare, which makes it powerful. At the same time, certain words naturally shape perception. When you speak about comfort, connection, or ease, those ideas become more present in her mind. She starts to interpret the moment through that lens, not because you told her to, but because her attention has been drawn there. And attention influences feeling more than most people realize. The key is that nothing you say should feel forced or calculated. It should come from what you genuinely notice in the moment. When it's real, she feels that authenticity immediately. And when she feels that, she relaxes even more into the interaction. This is how you move things forward without ever pushing. You're not directing her actions. You're helping her connect more deeply with what she's already experiencing. And when that connection becomes clear to her, the next step doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like the natural continuation of something that already exists between you. Now we step into something that completely changes the emotional tone of the interaction, and it's something most men overlook because they're too focused on what to do next instead of how to be in the moment. This is where your internal state becomes more important than any words you say or any move you try to make. Because the truth is, women don't just respond to what you do, they respond to what you feel underneath it. If you're tense, if you're overthinking, if you're focused on getting a specific outcome, that energy shows up whether you realize it or not. It comes through in your tone, your body language, your timing, even in the way you hold eye contact. And when that kind of pressure is present, even subtly, it disrupts the sense of ease she needs to stay open. This is why the idea of staying calm and grounded is not just some abstract advice. It's one of the most important elements in creating an environment where intimacy can develop naturally. When you're genuinely relaxed, when you're not trying to control the direction of things, when you're simply present and engaged in the moment, something shifts in her response. She starts to feel safe without having to think about it. Her body relaxes, her mind slows down, and she stops scanning for potential discomfort. And in that relaxed state, she becomes more open, more expressive, and more connected to her own feelings. That's where desire actually lives, not in tension, not in pressure, but in comfort and presence. But this kind of calmness has to be real. It can't be something you're pretending to have while internally you're anxious or focused on an outcome. Because she will pick up on that disconnect immediately. Women are highly sensitive to emotional consistency. And when what you show on the surface doesn't match what you feel underneath, it creates subtle unease. Real calm comes from letting go of the need for a specific result. It comes from being okay with wherever the interaction goes, whether it moves forward, slows down, or even stops entirely. And when you reach that point, your presence becomes naturally more attractive because it feels stable and grounded. This is also what allows her to soften emotionally. When she senses that you're not trying to take something from her, but instead you're simply sharing a moment with her, her guard lowers. She doesn't feel like she has to protect herself or manage the situation. She can just be in it. And that's when everything becomes easier. The conversation flows more naturally, the connection deepens without effort, and the progression of the interaction happens without any forced steps. It's no longer about trying to make something happen, it's about allowing something to unfold. When you hold that kind of presence consistently, you create a space where she feels comfortable enough to move closer on her own. And when that movement comes from her, it feels right, it feels mutual, and it removes the tension that usually leads to hesitation or resistance. Now we get into one of the most important moments in any interaction, the point where things could naturally move forward, but this is also where most men lose everything they've built. It usually happens when they try to turn the moment into a clear decision. They ask something that forces a yes or no answer, and without realizing it, they shift the entire experience from something emotional into something logical. The problem with that shift is simple. The moment she has to make a decision, her mind starts analyzing instead of feeling. She begins thinking about timing, consequences, what it means, how she might feel afterward. And even if everything felt right just seconds before, that analytical process introduces doubt. And doubt is what creates hesitation. So instead of asking for decisions, you shift the focus toward her feelings. You bring her attention inward rather than outward. Because when a woman is connected to how she feels in the moment, she stays present. And presence is where openness exists. This doesn't mean you're avoiding communication. It means you're changing the type of communication. Instead of pushing her to choose something, you invite her to express how she feels. And that alone changes the entire dynamic. It gives her control, it removes pressure, and it creates a sense of emotional safety that allows the interaction to continue naturally. For example, rather than asking something that forces a clear outcome, you might check in with her comfort. You might ask how the moment feels for her, whether she feels relaxed, whether the pace feels right. These kinds of questions don't trap her. They give her space to be honest without feeling like she's rejecting you. And here's the important part. Whatever her response is, you stay grounded. If she expresses hesitation, you don't react negatively or try to convince her otherwise. You simply acknowledge it, respect it, and keep the interaction relaxed. That response alone builds more trust than any attempt to push forward ever could. When she feels that level of respect, something shifts internally. She no longer feels like she has to defend her boundaries. Instead, she feels understood. And once that happens, the tension disappears. She becomes more comfortable, more open, and often more willing to move forward on her own terms. This is also why rejection becomes less of a factor, because you're not putting her in a position where she has to reject you. You're giving her space to express herself honestly without pressure. And when that space exists, her natural response is not to pull away, but to stay engaged. In many cases, after a moment of honesty like that, she actually moves closer, not because she was pushed, but because she now feels safe enough to follow her own desire. And that's the key difference. When she chooses based on how she feels, the connection deepens. When she's forced to decide, the connection often breaks. So instead of chasing answers, you stay connected to the moment. You let her feelings guide the pace, and by doing that, you create an interaction that feels mutual, balanced, and far more natural than anything driven by pressure or expectation. Now everything comes together, because when you step back and look at these ideas as a whole, you start to see that this isn't about tactics or clever lines. It's about creating the kind of experience where connection can grow without friction. Each principle you've learned works on its own, but the real power comes from how they support each other and shape the entire interaction from beginning to end. When you remove the need to ask directly, you eliminate pressure. When you focus on creating safety, trust, and anticipation, you give her the emotional foundation she needs to stay open. When you allow space instead of constantly pushing forward, you give her room to move toward you naturally. When you express what you notice instead of asking for something, you keep the interaction rooted in feeling instead of forcing it into logic. When you stay calm and grounded, you create stability that she can relax into. When you focus on her feelings instead of trying to get decisions, you keep her connected to the moment instead of pulling her into analysis. When you mirror her energy, you create a sense of alignment that feels natural and mutual. And when you let the moment lead instead of your agenda, everything begins to flow without resistance. Put together, this creates a completely different dynamic from what most men are used to. Instead of trying to make something happen, you're allowing something to unfold. Instead of chasing an outcome, you're building an experience. And in that experience, she feels safe, understood, and free to respond based on her own desire rather than external pressure. That's why this approach works. Not because it's forcing anything, but because it's aligned with how people naturally connect on an emotional level. You're not going against her instincts, you're working with them. And when you do that, everything becomes smoother, more authentic, and far more effective. If you stayed with me all the way through, I want you to drop a comment saying, "I watched till the end." I actually read through the comments, and it helps me see who's really paying attention and applying this in their own life. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your moment to do that, because I go deeper into this kind of psychology and connection than most of what you'll find out there. Also, take note of this. Most content stops at surface level advice, but what we covered here goes beyond that. Especially that final idea of letting the moment lead instead of forcing direction. That's the piece most people miss, and it's often the difference between interactions that feel strained and ones that feel completely natural. So take this, apply it with respect and awareness, and focus on creating real connection rather than chasing quick outcomes. When you do that, everything starts to change, not just in how others respond to you, but in how you experience these moments yourself. I'll see you in the next one.